Okay. So thank you so much for taking time to join me for this webinar that is obviously very near and dear to my heart because it is all about this brand new book that is coming out this week that's actually already available on Amazon. But more importantly, what I wanted to share is the philosophies behind the book because I think that's really important about not even, the book is really awesome and I hope that people buy it. But really my reflection process and kind of the outcomes for me as a practitioner separately from the book, I think are really powerful. And as I have been talking about them and sharing them with other colleagues, I found that it has been a great resource for them in helping to think about things differently, especially when we're talking about this conversation of employee engagement, which we're all trying to figure out how to engage employees, because ultimately when they're engaged, we are able to have them be more productive. They are basically achieving the goals that we're looking for within our organizations. And long story short, as an HR practitioner, they help make us look really good if they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And so with all that being said, employee engagement has really been the focus central point for a lot of us as far as strategic initiatives beyond compliance, or those kinds of things that we have to obviously take care of and limit the liability within our organizations. So I titled this webinar, it's Unstuck You, which is the name of the book, but really talking about this shift of moving towards intentional employee engagement. And I think that is kind of the missing piece that we have out there. I have a poll that's up if you want to choose to engage. I would love for you to do that, and that helps me kind of cater what we'll be discussing later on in this presentation to what's most relevant to those of you that are listening live. But if you're listening at a later point in time, because I will be sending this recording out to those who can't make it today live, feel free to participate as well, because I'd love to hear that information about what really resonates with you. And so what I'm looking for is what statement resonates the strongest for you. So when you're looking at those three, really kind of speaks to you, whether it's because it's something you're going through right now, or if you're going through it in the past, but it was something that was very monumental for you. And so A is, I dream of working for an organization that is as loyal to me as I am to it. And that could be that statement that has technically kind of died overall. B is, I struggle to find the balance among the many demands of life or the multiple roles that we have to carry. And C, it is hard for me to not allow outside opinions about my performance impact me. So when other people are weighing in on what we should do or shouldn't do, we have some struggles with trying to not let those lines be blurred. And so you can respond by either going to that website, or you can text at leadership is 241 and then text basically the number, text that phrase to the number 22333, and then it will open up a session and you can basically respond with A, B, or C. Or if you're really snazzy and you have your smartphone, you can essentially just open up your camera and hover it over the QR code, and it will take you to the website, which is really kind of snazzy and cool. And then you can kind of engage on your smartphone. Cool. All right, so let's get started and talk about what we're going to be discussing today. So I have really three major objectives, and this was shared in the introduction email as well as on the sign-up sheet. Maybe one of these reasons is why you really felt compelled to join us today. So number one is how self-reflective practice and inner work are essential to increase employee engagement within our organizations. So how those two things really are tying together. Number two is how employee engagement should not be strictly driven by leadership and HR practitioners. Employees must be empowered to do their part. So we talk a lot about leadership buy-in. Today I want to talk about buy-in in the other direction. And I think not having that or trying to obtain it in a different fashion, which usually what we're trying to do it through is like morale boosters, is really necessary for us to start shifting the needle in the right direction as in regards to employee engagement. And then three, how the work histories of our employees play a part in our engagement levels. Our organizational cultures are not the only influencing factor. So I think for as long as I have been a practitioner, we were always playing in our box. Sometimes we would network with other individuals and find other resources, but we never really took into account that when people come and work for us, they're bringing their own kind of baggage with them. And that is really having an impact on our engagement levels and whether someone is choosing to engage or not engage. And so we're going to talk about that together as well. So to get us started, I want to talk about this concept of a peak experience. And so what I want you to do is think about a time that you experienced a peak experience. And a peak experience is, and I think the image is very appropriate if you are watching along with us today, of being on top of this mountain, conquering something incredible, being in the right place at the right time and knowing that you're exactly where you're meant to be, or this sense of feeling like you're on fire. That you actually are contributing, having an impact, something that really resonates within you that tells you that this is exactly what you wanted or needed, or just, everything just seems right. Everything just fell into place. And this could be for a day, this could be for an hour, this could be for a few minutes that it's happened. It could have been an incredible year. But I want you to think back and see if you can identify a peak experience that you've had. And for our purposes, let's keep it isolated to your career. A peak experience that you've had in your career. And I'm going to stop talking and I'll mute it so you just have a little moment of silence and just do kind of an internal check with yourself of a peak experience that you have, a time where you felt like you were really bringing it and being valuable. And I want you to kind of just take yourself back to that time and revisit that experience and become familiar with it, okay? So take a minute or two and do that. And as you're familiarizing yourself with that peak experience, I want you to see if you could describe it in one word. And if you're open to sharing that one word with us, go ahead and respond with the next poll. And it's, once again, there's a QR code that's available. You can go to the website, or you can text leadership is 241-222-333. And then, well, you wouldn't text A, B, or C. You would text your word. So whatever word that would describe that peak experience that you're thinking about. All right, so the reason why we went through this little mini exercise about talking about a peak experience and talking about the one word to describe it is when we think back to those peak experiences, we may think about the details that surround it, but we start to really be drawn to a feeling. A feeling is what generates our peak experience. It's not necessarily the situation. So if we take something easy like a personal example, like when I gave birth to my daughters, seeing my children after giving birth to them, even though they're all gucky and gross, it is the feeling of the fact that I created this little miracle that I'm holding in my arms. It's that feeling of almost kind of pure joy, or however I would describe it, that is associated with that peak experience, something that makes me go back there. If I were to think about a peak experience where I was promoted to this position that I've been pursuing and working towards for a long period of time, that is, a feeling of accomplishment, or a feeling of having value or being worthy, whatever word would come to mind for me. But it's a feeling that really is fueling my passion to go there. And we use that word, even passion, interchangeably. Motivation, passion, those things that we're aiming for. And when we're talking about engagement, we're looking for that motivational, that intrinsic motivation. But the thing that we forget is that we're dealing with people, and so everybody has their own internal motivation. And we talk about that maybe loosely in a broader kind of context, but when we kind of dial in down on it, we realize that for us to really maximize someone's potential and engagement, there has to be this individualized kind of approach, which can seem very daunting. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, because how do we have time to touch base with all of these employees, especially if I'm an HR practitioner for 200, 500, maybe even 1,000 when I'm looking at what my umbrella is in my organizational structure. But one of the things I do want to close out and think about when we talk about this is, if you're not familiar with Simon Sinek's work, who's all about creating your why, he really talks about some very basic neuroscience concepts, which I think were really powerful. So on the screen, you're seeing basically a circle that represents the brain, and how the outer rim is basically the neocortex, and in the corner is the limbic system. The neocortex is where we house our thought processes that articulate what's and how's. So whenever somebody asks you what you do for a living, and you were to say, I'm an HR practitioner, I hire, fire, and do benefits, those are all kind of formulated thoughts that happen in the neocortex. Even the how. So how do you do those things? I hold people accountable. I do policies. How do I write policies? Those are all happening in our neocortex, that outer rim of the brain. The limbic system is what holds our why. It holds those feelings, those peak experience kinds of feelings. And really, those are the driving forces as to why we continue to function on a daily basis, what causes us to show up. The trick here is that the limbic system does not have the capacity for language, which means it can't tell us what it wants or needs. So even if you were to go around and be like, can you unveil what's in your limbic system to me? I want to understand as an employee what your limbic system needs are. What is that why that's in there? It's very difficult for someone to even articulate that. And for most, they've never even begun to explore it or even think about it. So the peak experience exercise that you went through very briefly just now is something that I do routinely with staff and individuals when we start talking about intrinsic motivation or maximizing their engagement level, taking them back to a time where they had a feeling that really caused them to drive to get someplace, a feeling that is a passion, or even if it was a blip that happened for a couple of minutes, it is what fuels them to keep going further and further. And it's how do we, number one, either use that emotion or feeling as a carrot to kind of attract them that way, or help them have awareness that that's what they're seeking, and being able to identify the what's and the hows that help them get there on a regular basis. But this is embedded in neuroscience. It's how our brain is functioning. And so knowing that the answer really lies in the center of our brains, but knowing that we have to find a way to kind of pull that out and understand what that means for them. Also taking into context that we have this very big equation when we're talking about overseeing a large amount of people and wanting the best for all of them and wanting them to all have their greatest potential. And now knowing that there's this really big individualized approach of essentially cracking an egg open, and what is that process going to be like? So point number one that I wanted to review today was really how self-reflective practice and inner work are essential to increase employee engagement within our organizations. The answer is that self-reflective practice, inner work, so just that little bit of going back and looking at your peak experience, identifying those feelings, and even further being able to identify what your why is or what your limbic system is trying to tell you, is really creating your personalized definition of engagement. As an employee, what I need to be engaged in your organization. But what it does is it generates all of these definitions of engagement, but it's still step one, is actually knowing what is the magical kind of solution or formula to engage that individual. And also realizing that we have individuals because we're embracing diversity and inclusion, and we need that to make our organization stronger. But we have to also approach it on an individualized approach. So this flows very nicely into step two, which is how does employee engagement, or how should employee engagement not be strictly driven by leadership and HR practitioners, that employees have to do their part. So as I was talking, if you really think about the magnitude of how big this can get, knowing that it's not just one person's burden to carry, that we're shifting our mindset, opening a door that's not the typical door that's open when we're tackling employee engagement, but showing employees that they have to do their part if they want to be an engaged workforce. And for most of us, we do a pretty good job already in the recruitment process of trying to identify those individuals who are driven, who want to engage, who want to show up at their best. And now it's a matter of how do we give those tool sets to allow them to continue to do that. So the concept I want to introduce to you here is it's a research collaborative inquiry method known as the 4 Ways of Knowing by John Heron and Peter Reason. And there's tons of papers that are out there that you can really dive into the nooks and cranny of this, but really at its basic level, here are the concepts that I think are really important for us to pay attention to. The 4 ways of knowing come down to basically experience, presentational, propositional, and practical. And as you see on your screen, experience is all about just having a life experience, having something happen to you and whatever that is in that moment. Presentational is about exploring that experience fully, so fully understanding it. And then propositional is being able to describe that life experience. And then practical is taking what we learned from that life experience and then using it to basically move us forward. That's when we see growth is happening. Now, what fascinates me about this research theory is that as adults, when we grow up, we believe that we're so good that we automatically eliminate one of the 4 ways of knowing. And that one of the 4 ways that we eliminate is actually presentational. So what happens for most of us as adults is essentially we do the other 3. We have something that happens to us. We have an experience that happens. So say, for example, an employee comes into you to complain about benefits or their benefits situation. And then we go directly to propositional. We can talk to a colleague. We can talk to a senior leader and describe what happened. So Susie Q came in and was complaining about her benefits. She doesn't understand. So listing all those kinds of things. And then practical is we apply what we have learned to our life from that life experience. It could be something as simple as Susie Q is annoying and I'm making that assumption about her. And so now every time I interact with her, she's going to ask me a gazillion questions because she can't understand anything. Maybe my practical could be, Susie Q had a lot of great questions, and so I haven't done more of an educational process, so I need to revisit that when we do open enrollment. It can really go in so many different places. But we do that on a pretty normal basis, that we just jump through those 3 steps. It seems pretty practical. Even at the propositional is describing it to yourself internally. Now, what presentational is giving the opportunity to explore something fully. And usually this is done through an expressive method or an abstract method. So art is a really great tool to use here because art activates the other side of the brain, and it allows us to really take all the perspectives in for a different scenario without moving to the place of describing it and then judging it and putting away takeaways. So, and when I say art, I don't expect that, like in our example with Susie Q complaining about the benefits, that she would get a paintbrush out and start painting a picture of Susie Q and see if you could see things differently. But there are other things like journaling or even self-reflection, where you're doing an inner kind of journal. So if you're someone who processes that way, where a journal entry is technically happening, but you're not writing it out, talking to somebody and asking them for their opinion. So, you know, doing so in abstract fashion. So how do you present it? So even if it was removing the Susie Q experience out there and maybe supplementing some of the questions to somebody, like what were Susie Q's concerns, and just hearing it from a different perspective. You can get really abstract and say things like, you know, go over to John and say, hey, I'm just curious if you were to decide, or if you were to describe the current status of your satisfaction with our benefits right now as a color, what color would it be and why? And so the whole idea is to be able to generate an answer that doesn't really have a right or wrong, but gives you the opportunity to look at things a little bit differently, but overall more fully. And then what happens is that we have the ability to have a more well-rounded opinion about whatever it is, and then really be able to articulate what we want to take away from that life experience. There are some of them where the outcome will not be different, and that's why we've, as adults, gotten really good at, we don't need to have presentational. That's silly to have presentational because I know what the outcomes are. But because we make that assumption, there's certain situations where we really could use that presentational, and we really need to seize that opportunity to see everything fully, and we're not taking that. And so it's just kind of food for thought and thinking about it. So let's take engagement for a specific reason. And we're going to get even more specifically as to what this looks like and how this cycle, I believe, applies to engagement. But thinking about it even in general context, you know, experience. We're experiencing a morale issue. I hear that not a lot of the time, but it's a common phrase that people use. I don't want to say that like everyone has this horrible engagement issue that I work with, but it's common that people say that they feel a sense of morale lowering, they're having engagement issues, they're experiencing that, they can feel it. And then propositional, they describe it. So tell me what that looks like. And then they'll give me specific circumstances about why people seem disengaged because they're, you know, not being as productive as they should be. And then what are the practical outcomes? And so we come up with things like, well, we need to find ways to motivate them. So we're going to have a holiday luncheon, or we're going to give away gifts. We find some ways to kind of reward because we think that's what's missing. But what if we were to integrate a presentational experience? So say that we know that there's low morale, we're experiencing it, we're feeling it in the organization. And so we're going to bring in a bunch of magazines and task everyone to do a collage. Now, I know this is like really kind of pushing it, but I want you to collage what is our work environment currently and how you feel about our work environment. What are images that really speak to you? Or maybe it's just one image to create a large image altogether. And so say that they do that, they put this big collage together, and when you look at the collage, there's no people on it. And you just see maybe tasks, you see paperwork, you see office supplies. Maybe if you're in manufacturing, you see symbols of what you create there. You see dollar signs. And then when you ask individuals, just state for me what you were seeking. And they're like, well, I was looking for what we believe is the main focus of our culture right now. And so anytime that we've used art activities with collages in the past, when people don't show up on a collage, when people don't feel like people, the actual image of people belong on those images, it sends a very powerful message to me, because people are our greatest asset, and they're the reason why we can really, truly thrive as an organization. We can be something different. It's based off the talent that we have. And so when our staff or our employees or even our leadership can't see where people belong in the organization or as a necessity, it makes me worry a little bit. And so having that kind of presentational experience that happens and then describing it, so even having the people then describe why they picked those images, it's going to change completely what that practical kind of outcome is. And so even, we do, another great example of this is when we go out for assessments, I like to use SWOT analysis, and people always make make some sort of comment because it's a typical kind of business analysis that is commonly used. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We go out and kind of lay the foundation for them. It is our presentational experience for us to identify what already leadership has told us they're experiencing, but we want to fully understand it. And then we do it through discussion. But when I have them talk about their SWOT analysis, I tell them, I want you to pay attention to things that are happening around you. Billboards, when you're thinking about opportunities and threats, pay attention to things that really stand out to you and make notes of those. And every SWOT analysis is so different as to what they pay attention to and what they don't. There's some that even though we're focused on the organization, they can't get over doing a personal SWOT analysis by tearing themselves apart. And so they can't even begin to focus on critiquing the organization because they don't even feel they're worthy of that. And so those are some really powerful things when you hear people talking about them from that side, and that adds a whole nother dynamic to when we're doing any kind of business planning or strategy and trying to figure out, this is what we're experiencing, but what does it really mean? And what is the actual practical step that we have to take forward? And so this theory is a research-based theory. It was meant for observation, but it's amazing how it comes alive in so many capacities. And the presentational level fascinates me because what you can use for expressive arts are things that feel strange. There's not a lot of cultures who use any kind of highly expressive art or tackle things using abstract discussions, but that is to our advantage. It makes it so that people can't really fully prepare for how to respond to that. They can't tell you what is the best collage. They can't tell you, what are the top strengths that I expect to see in a certain kind of scenario. If you have them describing things as a color, like if you're going to describe the company's top organizational strength as a color, what would it be and why? There's no right answer there. And then we're just starting that brain and that processing, and it's growth for them, but it's also growth for the others. So I say all that because when we're talking about employees have to do their part, we've seen it already in the, identifying your why and your personal definition. Only the employee can go into their limbic system and help articulate and help start identifying those feelings that are necessary to fuel engagement. Employees doing their part, actively coming in and participating in the 4 ways of knowing, they have to be able to do that to give their contribution so that we can see the outcome. That's no different with any other strategy. When we say that we have to obtain buy-in, we have to have all the stakeholders involved and make sure that they are all aware of things as we're moving forward. Those pieces are key. So 3 is going to bring it all together, and how all of this is kind of woven, and how I think is one of the best places for us to start, but is respecting the fact that work histories play a part in engagement levels as well. Not only work histories, but also who I am as a person and how I was raised. That why or reason or description that comes from the limbic system, when you fully unpack that, a lot of it is woven from how you were raised or your values or what's at the core of you. And so we need to respect that those things are important, that when we're doing recruitment, we're looking for those things. We're looking for those core values that someone has personally that align with our organizational culture, and we're looking for that fit. And so we have to pay respect for them in this atmosphere as well as to how to maximize engagement and keep them motivated. So when I think about this concept of really diving into this inner work, or this self-reflection, this individualized approach, there's this quote that is from Marilyn Monroe that really resonated with me. And if you know the story about Marilyn Monroe, it was not she was successful and she was a celebrity, but it was much of a tragedy in how she felt alone. But she says, I have feelings too. I'm still human. All I want is to be loved for myself and for my talent. And so, here's somebody who was wildly talented. So many people wanted a piece of her in multiple different ways, but talking about how I have feelings too, and I am still human. And all I want is to be loved for myself and for my talent. And for a lot of employees, this is not so different. This whole idea of wanting to feel loved. I heard from a friend probably about a year ago, when he was presenting, he talked about how we need to pay respect to the fact that a lot of, especially the younger generation, when they're starting their jobs, they believe that management, even HR, kind of serve as like the sub-parental force. So as they're getting released out into the world, we're the ones that are going to take care of them. There's this assumption out there that we will be the ones that help take care and care that they have feelings and see that they're human and want what's best for them and treat them so that they're worthy and valued and really have their talent kind of show up. And it's really interesting because actually last night I teach at a local college, and I had a conversation with one of my students at the end of class who's in the process of interviewing, preparing for graduating in that next step. And he asked me what my thoughts were as far as his strategy for interviewing. And I told him, I said, I think you're very bright. And I think if you just want to go and sell them on you, you can do that. Or are you looking for a place to go where you're going to be appreciated for your talent and seen as an individual? And if that's the case, then you might want to give some extra thought as to what questions you want to ask. What do you want to get curious about? What's really important for you at that organization? If you're just going in with the intent of getting yes and adding to your resume, that's fine too. That's part of the kind of career path that we all go through, but just understand what's your intent. Because one of the things that I guess it's like a personal pet peeve, when somebody goes out and they put their heart and soul into an interview, get a job, and then realize it's not what they thought it was. And it's almost heartbreaking to them. So I say all this because really at the core of it, there's this other piece of HR that I think we do, but we don't really articulate, for the simple fact that it's a little more maternal. And we've spent a long time of trying to make sure that we sell our value and who we are strategically. And so we kind of steer away from those, even though those maternal kind of aspects of the HR position are still very alive and well, but they just kind of happen naturally without really bringing emphasis to them. But I want to look at that side and kind of magnify it, and recognizing that, there's a role in HR where you are a healer. You are someone who is helping to repair and rebuild individuals. And when you're asking yourself, what are you healing? And I'm not talking about drug addiction or depression. Yes, that's what EAP programs are for. That's why we make referrals. But we inherit people with the baggage that they come from past workplaces. We inherit people when we hire them. They can have so much potential, but we have to help get them back to a place where they're not traumatized from wherever they went through. And if you're someone who's ever had to experience a bad leader, a bad supervisor, and even if this goes into having a tough home life in the sense that you just had parents who were very overbearing or failure wasn't an option, those things are getting carried into the work environment. And it is with care that we had to figure out how to either heal the thought process that's happening, or being mindful that we're there to actually help those individuals, because we're there to help them get to their best and give them those resources. And so I talked about this concept about 2 months ago at a SHRM leadership forum. And the first question that came out was, Well, how do we do that? So if I embrace your thought process of wanting to put the human back in human resources, of being this kind of healer, of making note that, you know, workplaces past the buildup and the baggage that comes with them, and I see the potential in the individual, how do I even start unpacking that? Even if I know specifically one person that I could be helping. And then when I was thinking about that, I didn't even put it together that what I was thinking through and already processing in this book that I was putting together is essentially that. You know, those objectives that I laid through about talking the importance about this inner work and this mutual accountability in someone's engagement, they have to be engaged and involved. And this also means that there's a perfect timing for when we have these conversations, because if someone has been left out there and disengaged for long periods of time, it's going to take some extra nudging to have them want to engage in doing some inner work to try to clean up and start to heal these things. And so what you're looking at on your screen is what I'm calling disengagement cycles. And this is what I truly believe happens in our organizations and why disengagement exists. It happens for every individual. And it's basically a cycle, which is very, very close to Heron and Reason's 4 ways of knowing, that, you know, when these individuals are coming into our work environments, they're experiencing moments, they're having reactions, they're putting a purpose associated with whatever happened to them, and then creating a takeaway. And that takeaway, unfortunately, is these buildups of these that are generating a result, which is disengagement. They're basically fueling that. So I don't think disengagement happens after one of these, but if you think about a year span, all these things building up, or if you think about if you have a horrible leader with that is torturing individuals, that screams at them, that yells at them, it's not that one time. It's those multiple times that are happening. It's what's happening with that buildup that's there. So when we talk about disengagement cycle, let's just break down these four steps, or what happens when I was talking about a little clearer. So step 1 is that the moment. So this is what actually happens that occurs for a cycle to start occurring, where they're starting to process them. And then the second step is the surface. This is your initial reaction to experiencing the triggering event. And then the next one is purpose. This is the meaning you associate with the triggering event after feeling your reaction. And then the takeaway, this is the materialization of the lesson learned as a result of the triggering event, reaction, feeling, and associated meaning. So I'm going to share a disengagement cycle that I went through. This is probably one where things have built up, so they become even larger and more difficult to kind of handle. And then I will show you how these kind of equate in these 4 different kind of levels and processes. All right. And so this disengagement cycle that I'm going to share is actually inspired by the first poll question that we had out there. So the statement that really resonated the most with individuals, this is one of my cycles that I believe is very connected with that kind of outcome. So professionally, I had the position of my dreams, and my personal life was going through a new series of changes. I'd recently given birth to my first child, a beautiful little girl, Marilyn. For most of my life, I had treated marriage and children as something we were all meant to do. It was simply a part of the expected life path. I was in no way prepared for the change that motherhood brings, the change in perspective and priorities that occurs when you become a mother. When in pursuit of my dream job, I had always expected long hours and limited time at home would come with the territory. To be honest, I was okay with that. I thrived on high levels of professional stress, and it made me feel significant in my life. However, when this new little life came into my world, everything changed. The first day I returned to work, I had to leave before Madeline had even woken up for the day, and by the time I got home, she was already asleep in bed. We were also fortunate as first-time parents that our daughter was already sleeping through the night. Man, did this girl love to sleep, and she still does. As I would travel to and from work, I would cry in the car for my 45-minute commute. I assumed it would get easier, and it was all part of the transition. It got a little easier, but nevertheless, as I read the notes coming home from the daycare teacher filled with all the mini milestones I was missing, it began to take a toll on my heart. I was an awful mom, and I wasn't even present to be a mother. I tried to negotiate with my place of employment to see if there was any way to have a more flexible work schedule. Yet the demands of my responsibilities left little to no flexibility, and I knew that. In an attempt to express their understanding of my situation, they offered to pay for my husband and Marilyn to accompany me when I traveled. However, my travel itinerary was already overextended to ensure my trips were as productive as possible, and therefore the routine was the same. I would leave before Madeline was awake and return after she was asleep. The only differences were it was in a hotel, so Maddie had a hard time sleeping through the night in a strange place/bed, and my husband was left to entertain her throughout the day in a random city without a car. I remember hurrying back to the hotel every evening to provide him some reprieve and allowing him to go out and have some time of his own. It is safe to say it did not make the situation better. After months of what seemed like an eternity of being torn, I decided it was best to leave my position, so I resigned without an intention of looking for another job. I decided my best bet was to be a stay-at-home mom, since I really had no idea how to find a job that wouldn't put me back in a similar situation. It seemed to me that in life you have to choose between being a mother or having a career. For me, I had to choose being a mother. I refused to bring life into this world and not be present to help and watch her grow. So let's just take that story and break it down into the 4 cycles or the 4 steps that are in a cycle. So the moment that occurred, so the triggering event that occurred was that I gave birth to my first child. When I returned to work, my work demands prevented me from spending any time with her. So that's basically, in a nutshell, that's what triggered all of this happening. The surface. So this is my initial reaction to that event that occurred. I am a bad mother. That was the first thing that came to my mind as a reaction, that all of this meant that I was a horrible mother. The purpose, that I had to choose between being a mother or having a career, that you cannot thrive at both. So I thought the purpose of this event that happened, the way that I internalized it, was that I had to choose. And then the takeaway, the actual way that it materialized, is that I quit my job to be a stay-at-home mom. So I just completely left the industry because I didn't know what else to do. So this is an example of, something that's pretty big that happened. Not everyone leaves their job. However, I think there's a lot of things that kind of trigger and build up to that. So even if you think about a moment when someone gets screamed at by a supervisor, their initial reaction could be that I'm stupid. The purpose is to show them that they don't know what they're doing, and they're probably going to get fired. The takeaway is they start looking for another job, or they start making more screw-ups because they're so high anxiety because they think that they're getting fired. So they're going to, maybe the takeaway is to try harder, but the actual outcome is that you're seeing it getting even more sloppy or more high stress. And so I think these happen on an ongoing basis until the takeaway, the materialization, is leaving, disengagement ultimately, in whatever fashion that is. But these takeaways also are the little pieces of disengagement. When we start saying things like, oh, I think Johnny, there's something off. He's not as driven or as productive as he used to be. We start to see these shifts that happen, but they're not so detrimental that we're super concerned. But it's the buildup of these events that start to result in that. And so what I believe is that we need to take those cycles and really go back and understand what was the purpose that was there. For me, I can tell you that going through almost a presentational knowing for that story that we shared was really at the core of it. What really was the lesson and the takeaway was that I needed to have some work-life balance. And I don't really believe in that concept, but I believe in the concept of having a balanced life. And I don't know if I would have ever really looked at it. It's just unfortunate that it caused a end or pause in my career for me to realize that it got to that point. But really what the lesson was is identifying how I needed to have a balanced life, reevaluating my priorities, But we don't get to those thought processes unless we're led down that path, unless we are guided. And so I bring up this image again because I'm really passionate about breaking down disengagement cycles. And I think it's a long process. I think you start with the really big ones and then you kind of morph through. And I think there's 3 levels of those disengagement cycles that people go through. At the core of them, and the colors are done on purpose, so they go from dark to lighter because that's the intensity that's surrounding them. But at the core is the truth level, which are things that are really ingrained to who you are specifically. They're value driven. They're things that really kind of tore into you. They're probably directly tied to anything that would be materializing and tied directly to your limbic system, something that would be described there. It just touches you and hits you to the core. They're usually the most difficult things to unpack. If it is a disengagement cycle or a toxic situation that happened in the work environment, it's one that we've suppressed and tucked somewhere. And usually say, because we got through it, it made me stronger, and I don't have to unpack it. But not unpacking it means we haven't really gone there and figured out what really were all the lessons that we needed to have. The next level is love, and this is where you have your balanced kind of life. How do I make sure that I'm doing what I need to do to make sure I feel loved? And that I am fueled to keep moving forward. So the story that I just shared would fall in that realm. And then the outer rim is joy. So these are not as dark to process, but am I doing the things that really specifically fuel that peak experience feeling, that going all the way back to talking about the limbic system? This is how we figure out the hows. Like, if a situation is generating some sort of surface reaction of purpose and takeaway that's leading to disengagement, it probably means that it's out of alignment with what I need to be doing to make sure I maintain that connection to what I kind of tapped into from the limbic system. So those are our 3 points. They all really tie in together nicely, talking about how I really think at the core of employee engagement is encouraging our individuals to engage in self-reflective practice and doing some inner work and creating safe environments for that to happen. When we talk about inner work and self-reflective practice, people automatically think about therapy. Therapy, I think, is 100% very healthy and something that we should continually kind of encourage. There's nothing wrong with processing and having a full understanding, as we kind of just discussed in this entire hour together. But also moving this burden of employee engagement beyond just leadership and HR practitioners, that employees are just as invested and accountable for being engaged and wanting to be there. Because for some of them, say that in the limbic system, what really drives you or why is that they don't want to be there. And that is a huge kind of piece there as well, that they're afraid of pursuing what their actual dream is or their goal is. But that's resulting in them having disengaging behavior and holding back the rest of the team. And then also being mindful and knowing that, when we're talking about this inner work, they're not going to unpack just situations from this workplace. In some situations, they're unpacking things from others, but it needs to happen so that they can process it. And then know that our organizational cultures, yes, they influence the ability to engage, but not always. Sometimes we have a lens carried from a past workplace, and we're seeing things in this new culture that don't really exist, but it's just because of what we carry through. We have like a tainted lens when we're looking at them. And so it really comes back to feeling. It really comes back to intuitive kind of guidance that I think is just missing and we've lost. So in this book, Unstuck You, I put this at the beginning. It says, stay close, and if you drift away, come closer still. Feel again. Just feel again. If we integrate that feeling, if we focus on this concept of, what do we feel when we have a peak experience? What are those emotions like? That is really the guiding force for driving our passion. That is really the guiding force for maintaining engagement. And so the book is dedicated for the once passionate professional whose childhood dreams of who I want to be when I grow up slowly died. And I think that is where these disengagement cycles start. They start way before they come into our workplaces. or they go through the other workplaces. I think it starts when their dreams start to die of what they wanted to be when they grow up. When people start to insert their thoughts as to what they should be or who they want to be. And so the book is, I gave you a taste of these disengagement cycles, a story that I read that is in there. And it basically is a self-guided tool to help people start unpacking those cycles. It also serves as a facilitator guide to help you fully understand all these concepts that we kind of went through very quickly, to start beginning and thinking about how to integrate those within your organization, to start creating that safe space and starting to encourage this different kind of thought process and a different way of engaging people. And so with that, I am going to thank you for your time today. Thank you for listening. It just means the world to me that you take time out of your day to just give me your attention. And as always, if there's any way that I can be helpful, so as you're thinking about these concepts and they're completely new, and I also totally respect that, you know, all the work environments are completely different and you're dealing with all kinds of dynamics. But if you're interested and you want to integrate this work and you want to know what step one is, you know, I'm always open for a great brainstorm. I feel like this work is so needed and has the ability to do some incredible things in our organizations and for those who work in our organizations. But with that, have a great day, and I will talk to all of you later. Thank you.